Welcome to everyone for Intersection, where theology and practice meet. We're very glad that you are all here. Our guest today is Jared Alcantara, who teaches preaching at Baylor and has expertise in preaching across cultures and interculturally. And we're going to try to talk about why it's important for us to talk about that. So we're going to do as we normally do. We're going to have just a few moments of silence, and then I'm going to pray for us and introduce our topic. All praise to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and evermore shall be, world without end. Amen. Jared, welcome. We're really glad to have you here. While we were sleeping, the world changed. We look around and we don't really recognize the world we grew up in. And so why don't you take a little time to explain to us the world we now live in, and then we'll talk about what it means to preach in that kind of a world.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me, Randy. And yeah, the world is changing. If you know that story, Rip Van Winkle, he goes to sleep for 20 years and wakes up, and everything is different. So there are ways in which that story is happening when it comes to realities on the ground today too. So I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about preaching in an intercultural future, and I just want to do some 30,000 feet kind of things at the beginning in order to frame how I come into this conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about how the world is changing and how in particular the US is changing. So let me share my screen real quick and share this with all of you. And you can see that, Randy, hopefully, and our participants can. So let me just talk a little bit more about demographic shifts and how those shifts are impacting the nation, but also impacting churches. So this is a slide that shows documented immigration in the 1960s. And what you see here is it's split down the middle. You have Europe, Canada, Oceania on one side, and you have Asia, Latin America, and Africa on the other, 49, 2% unspecified. So that's the 1960s for documented immigration. And then when you move to a year like 2019, here's an example of the shift. So Asia, Latin America, and Africa representing 88% of documented migrants, and this isn't to add undocumented migrants as well. So the numbers would be even more exaggerated. And then Europe, Oceania, and Canada account for 11% of documented immigration to the United States. So you see shifts, continental shifts, when it comes to who is coming to the United States. And then that impacts projections. And so for 2050, between now and then, the US will grow by 2 million every year. Right now, approximately in 2021, 1 in 7 are foreign born. So last year, we're coming to the end of 2022, but 1 in 7 were foreign born in 2021. Now it's 1 in 5, or will be 1 in 5. The African-American population will grow, Asian American population will triple, Latinx population will triple. 2010 was the first year that more minority babies were born in the US than majority babies. 2014 was the first year that there were more non-white children in public schools than white children. And then you just see even median ages. And so for the white population, it's 43.7, Black Americans, 34.6, Asian Americans, 37.5, Latino, 29.8. And then there's this rapid growth of biracial population too. So I'm half Latino, half white. I think that's becoming more and more common, that you'll have people of mixed race and ethnicity. In 2021, there were 6 states plus Washington, D.C., in which minorities were the majority: California, New Mexico, Nevada, Hawaii, Texas. Here in Texas as well, that's the case, in Maryland. And so now they're predicting anywhere between 2041 and 2046 that the overall population in the United States will be minority as majority. So this is just a picture for those who are more visual in their learning and in their thinking. 1960, 85-15 percentage, 2012, 63-37, and then somewhere in that range, 2041 to 2046, that tipping point will happen. And it does impact Texas. So people of color made up 95% of the growth in Texas. So Texas grew by 2 million people from the 2010 to 2020 census. And then just you see, this is from the Texas Tribune from 2021, the state's Hispanic population is now nearly as large, just 1 percentage point. I think it's 38% to 37%. It's that close here in Texas in terms of the growth of the Latino population. So there's this reality of pluralism, that we're living in a time and an age in which more and more people are coming from other parts of the world. And there are more and more people of various races and ethnicities, and more people of mixed races and ethnicities. But part of what I want to do to connect this to the church, only a few people have connected the dots between Christianity's shifts south and east and current demographic shifts and projections for the population in the United States. So in other words, the church is also growing in various ways that we might not have really thought fully about. So this is from Mark Pornick's book, The Word Made Global. He looks at African churches in New York, and he says, in New York City, you don't have to travel to another country to experience African Christianity. All you need to do is get on the subway. This is happening in Boston too. It's called the Quiet Revival. There's an organization called the Emmanuel Gospel Center, and they show that Boston's Christian church community, and here's a quote, it's characterized by a growing unity, increased prayer, maturing church systems, a strong and trained leadership. So we might think New England, hard soil, people not connected to churches, lapsed Catholics and Protestants. And that is the case in many spaces in New England, but it's also the case that there are these immigrant churches from Haiti or from Brazil or from other places that in many ways are doing these off-the-grid ministries. That's why it's called the Quiet Revival. Very few people know about it. My friend Manoj, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I want to make sure that I understand this. I think I do. So it's pretty observable that the demographics of the United States is rapidly changing. And there is this narrative about increased secularity, but much of that immigrant population are not that secular. They're bringing in all sorts of religious commitments that could be a source of renewal in churches that are sort of bogged down every place else. Am I sort of getting that?
Yes, I think so. So one of the things I like to say is that Portuguese-speaking Brazilians don't take USA Today polls, who are Christian, right? Who they don't take a lot of the polls that you might find in various newspapers, magazines, or even research groups. So that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are rapidly disaffiliating from organized religion at the same time. So there's a rapid growth of atheists and agnostics, a rapid growth of those who are de-churched, unchurched. But at the same time, approximately 3 out of 4 of those who are documented immigrants to the United States self-identify as Christians. And so we might even have an idea in our minds of people of other faiths coming to the United States because they come from nations or regions where it's a huge Muslim population or Hindu population or what have you, when in fact the data reveal that approximately 3 out of every 4 of documented migrants, and that doesn't include undocumented migrants, many of whom come from very Christianized regions, nations, that they're self-identifying, self-reporting as Christians. So there's this is my friend Manoj from Nepal. Christianity's only been legal there for 55 years. And when he came to the US in 2008, there were only 5 Nepali Christian churches that he knew about. Now there's 150. Or Korean churches were under 2,000 in number in the 1990s and are now well over 4,000 in the 2020s. And so you see decline, and you see regression in some spaces, but you also see rapid growth in other spaces. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let me stop there in terms of slides, and would love to talk to you just about how these changes are coming into effect. That's part of what I'm trying to point us to, that Christianity is changing and shifting. Diana Butler Bass wrote a book called Christianity After Religion. She said that Christianity was going through a bear market rather than a bull market, a great religious recession, she called it. And that may be true in some ways, but what I'm trying to point us to is that in other ways, Christianity is thriving, perhaps off the grid. It's changing, it's shifting, it's moving in ways that we are still trying to better comprehend. In a way, it's de-Europeanizing too. That's a Stephen Warner term, Europeanization.
So if you find yourself in, let's say, preaching in what has been a predominantly white church, okay, so hopefully that's going to be changing as at least you'd hope so, as the demographics change, that somehow a church is going to be able to participate in that. How do you think about your work differently as a pastor and a preacher at a church? How do you lean into the future in ways that will be helpful?
Well, I think there are a couple different ways to answer that question. One would be to better know your surrounding context. And so let me just share by way of story. I did my doctoral degree at Princeton Seminary. And there was a Latino professor there named Luis Rivera Pegan. My last name's Alcantara, my father from Honduras. And sometimes people would come up to him and they would say, I wish that there were more Latinos at Princeton Seminary. Why aren't there enough Latinos? And his answer would be, there are plenty of Latinos here, you just don't see them. And what was he pointing to is that, yes, there needed to be more Latino and Latina students at PTS, but there were actually plenty of Latinos and Latinas who were working at Princeton Seminary. There were plenty of Latinos and Latinas who were working in close proximity to Princeton Seminary, plenty of Latinos and Latinas in the public schools, plenty in Mercer County. And so he was inviting those who might not see that there's more diversity around them than they realize to see that. He was trying to move them to more of a greater consciousness. No, actually just within a few miles of here, if you just did an ethnographic study, you'd see it's a lot more diverse than it might even look like in this couple of acres in which you're attending school. So I think that'd be a first step, is to know your surrounding community a little better. And even if it feels like there's not a lot of racial and ethnic diversity in your surrounding community, I think you can make a strong case if you zoom out only just a little bit further, think about your county or your region or the major cities in Texas, if we're talking specifically about Texas, and what it means to do ministry and anticipate how church ministry will change in your own community, in your own county, in your own region, and in the cities that are close by.
Yeah, do you have any sort of, there's a sense in which all ministry is local ministry, right? But can you paint any broad strokes about the way the churches can start to adapt to that world? And I think we often think about, okay, we want to be welcoming places, but that's really not enough if it's just a white church that welcomes people who aren't white. I mean, how does the church itself become transformed by the changes around it in positive ways?
When I think of my own church here in Waco. I worship at a Baptist church here in the city, and it's a city church, and so it had already established ministries to the homeless, ministries that partner with nonprofits to help people in need. But the next phase for the church where I'm a member was to start a nonprofit, because it's in a city of over 100,000. And it launched a Hispanic church that considers itself part of this larger church. And so they have combined services a couple times a year, I think at least every quarter. There's a Hispanic ministries pastor who's part of the staff, but also preaches every week in Spanish to that congregation. I preach to that congregation sometimes too, which is just a joy and an honor and a privilege. The nonprofit part is people who are trying to learn a new language, or trying to find a job, or trying to find housing, or just other ministries of compassion, assistance in various ways. And then that allows partnerships to happen where you don't have this siloing. So there are better and worse ways to do multi-ethnic ministry if you're going to have like a parish model where there's a predominantly white congregation and a Latino congregation, Korean congregation, or a Chinese congregation, or what have you, depending on your community. One of the worst ways to do it would be to have these totally separate bodies where there's no partnership or collaboration. So there's collaboration through having services together, but then there's also collaboration through serving together. So volunteers who do English language learning, volunteers who help with the nonprofit ministry during the week. Now, this is scaled up. This is a bigger church, so not every smaller church would be able to start a nonprofit. I think some practical questions that folks could ask would just be, what does it mean to serve people in need in my community? And those people in need, especially if they're immigrants to the United States, will have those very practical needs like jobs and housing and language, education, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's some ways to ask those questions and to find out the answers to them, just as we seek a thicker description of our community around us.
And one of your areas of particular interest is preaching. So what if I suddenly find myself preaching to all different sorts of people, and I start looking at my sermons and I find out that all of my illustrations come from my experience in life, which is not what a lot of the people sitting in the pews have. How do I adopt and adapt and make sure I'm not just talking to one group of people?
Yes. I instantly thought of something that happened to me. I find myself in various contexts. Sometimes it's almost all Latina context. Other times it would be predominantly Black context, because I've written about Gardner C. Taylor, who's a well-known African-American preacher, and I've done some of my writing and work in Black churches too. But I just instantly thought of a story from when I was in a predominantly Latino context, and I was partnering with a professor at another school, and that professor's illustration when he was talking about something on faith and work, but he talked about how he and his wife had spent significant time at an art farm in Wisconsin, and when they were at this art farm doing work, they had this revelation or something like that. And so I use that example as he's saying this to bivocational Latino pastors, right? Who vacation is a luxury, and it's definitely a luxury to go to an art farm. And it was innocent, right? He didn't mean anything by it, but there was a mismatch, right? So the audience would be people who are bivocational and trying to make ends meet and dreaming about their kids going to college. Perhaps they haven't been able to go to college. Perhaps their kids were born in the United States. Perhaps they were born elsewhere. So when we put on that hat as preachers, we have to interrogate our illustrations. Does everybody look like me in the illustrations that I provide? So just as there can be an Abraham Lincoln illustration, there can also be a Harriet Tubman illustration. Or just as there can be an Andre Agassi illustration, there can also be a Serena Williams illustration, just to give two examples. So if we start telling stories about people who don't look like us, or our encounters with people who don't look like us, that only helps us in multi-ethnic, multicultural spaces. The story I just shared was about class, right, as well. So folks who are preaching, regardless of the race or ethnicity of the person across from you, if that person can't relate to a story you're telling about going on vacation far away from the community in which you're ministering, then there's going to be a gap. There's a line by Ian Pitt Watson in his book, Preaching a Kind of Folly. And he says that most preachers speak the language of Canaan, and most people speak the language of Babylon. And what preachers need is to learn to speak better Babylonian. So he's trying to get preachers out of, I'm not saying we can't use religious words and we can't teach people new words, because that's part of what it means to help them understand doctrine better. What I'm trying to point out, and what I think Ian Pitt Watson's trying to point out, is knowing the lingua franca of your people, knowing what the local dialect is, knowing what an accent sounds like in your context, so that people can more ably understand you and relate to you.
Let's suppose that you have, as the trends would suggest, an increasingly diverse congregation. Is having separate worship services the way to go? I mean, with you may have language issues, at least with first generation. At some point, I want to talk about the difference in first, second, and third generations and how you think about that. But is just kind of dumping them all in the same worship service basically a bad idea? Do you want to find other ways to interact besides that? What do you think about that?
Good question. I mean, the short answer is that, of course, it depends on context, right? I'll give you an example that I preach in immigrant churches in which there are multiple services in multiple languages. So you might think in your mind, immigrant church, Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, but I speak Spanish, but I don't speak Mandarin or Korean. So I'm invited to the English speaking service, because what will happen is you have first generation immigrants whose children grew up in the public schools and might not speak the mother tongue. And so often the median age is quite young, a lot of youth, a lot of young adults. In immigrant churches, there is a real challenge for how to pass the faith, pass the torch on to the next generation, because there's so much cultural affinity. There's a certain holding on for the first generation that if they were to somehow pass all of that leadership to the second generation, that they would lose a lot of the cultural ties that are so important and that make it feel like a safe place to be in a world that might be really unfamiliar, especially if you don't speak the language very well. No, I don't think the answer universally is that everyone's in the same service together. So you have to think about language. You have to think about worship styles. You have to think about what it looks like and sounds like to be in partnership together. So our church's answer is that there are these quarterly worship services that are in English and Spanish. Other churches have gone about it where at every service there might be language translation provided, where someone has an earpiece, but then there's a different service that's entirely in the native tongue of that person that they can go to. Some churches 9:30, English and Spanish provided, 11 o'clock English or 8 a.m. Spanish. There's just lots of different models. I think of Michael Emerson's book, United by Faith. So he and another sociologist wrote a book called Divided by Faith in the early 2000s. They wrote a book called United by Faith, in which they talk about better and worse ways to engage in multiracial, multi-ethnic church ministry. So I just commend that as a resource, because there are better and worse ways to do it.
So there is a question in the Q&A that's a complex one, but it's basically asking about the difference in first generation and second and third generation immigrant communities, where the second and third generations often begin to look more and more like the post-Christian American communities in which they find themselves embedded, and less like the first generation, which might be more predisposed towards Christian faith. How do you have any wisdom on that? How do you think about first and second and third generation immigrant communities?
Yeah, good question. I thought of a couple things in terms of response. So often the first generation might come from a highly religious nation, even if Christianity is the minority in the nation, such as in South Korea. They come to the United States, and there are these intense secularizing influences that impact their families, and that can be very, very scary, especially if people have been Christians in their families for generations. So by way of example, I think of some of my students in seminary. Let's say they grew up in South Korea, or they grew up in Mexico or Costa Rica or something like that. And they were youth ministers in their country of origin. And then they came to the seminary in the United States and became youth ministers in the United States. And they would sit with me in my office and they'd say, I don't understand Latino US kids, or I don't understand Korean Americans. I understand Korean kids, or I understand Mexican kids. I don't really understand these kids. And I think that goes to show that there is a certain secularizing influence that can be quite scary as Christianity is passed from one generation to the next. So like I had some neighbors in Illinois when I lived there who both, they're both from Mexico. The wife was a migrant worker. The husband did manual labor. But they came to the US, their daughter was in public schools, and she wanted to do all the things that her friends wanted to do. She, one week she came home, she's like, I want to be a vegan this week. And next week she came home and said, I'm a fruitarian now, or whatever, And for her parents, they're talking to me in Spanish, like a vegan, what? They were so used to meat as a centerpiece of every meal that they couldn't even relate. And this is her mom, who grew up as a migrant worker in fields, right? So she couldn't really relate to her daughter. So that's just a sample or a story that goes to show that the gap can be extreme, and it can go both ways. Like in Chicago, for example, I knew pastors who were pastoring Asian American young adults who had no place to call home at their home church, because once they hit 18 or 20 and they were out of, like, say, the youth service in English, all the adults worshiped over in the Mandarin speaking or Korean speaking congregation, and there really was no space for them, so they felt like that they were wandering. So this was people who were pastoring multi-ethnic Asian American churches. Sometimes we think multi-ethnic and we think black, white, brown. But multi-ethnic in this case meant Korean American, Chinese American, Vietnamese American, all of whom were a certain age, but had no real church to call home. So that's really hard work. There has to be a mutual commitment from the first generation to the second generation, a willingness to pass the torch, in which case sometimes that doesn't happen, and a willingness sometimes to let go of the dream that all of those cultural ties will continue, especially if the second or third generation identifies more with being American than with being Honduran or being Korea. I hope that helps.
That sounds hard. um, so how do you move from being a host who says you're welcome to my party to being a church that says this is your party too, and you're not just a guest here, you're part of the leadership and the formation, and you're not just a welcome guest, because I think most of us would be welcoming, but how do you take that next step so that your community itself is transformed by people who might be coming there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I instantly thought of a friend of mine, Brian Loritz, who's written a lot on multi-ethnic church ministry. But one of the things he likes to say is that multi-ethnic ministry begins at the dinner table. So if we only worship with people, let's say we have a vision for a multi-ethnic church, multiracial church, multilingual church even, which in a lot of ways is in accordance with the vision at Pentecost, right? But let's say that's our vision, but the only times we're interacting with people who don't look like us for 60 to 90 minutes or however long your worship service is on Sunday morning. So one of the reasons why he says it begins at the dinner table is there has to be a creating of space in the rest of our lives as well to interact with people who don't look like us. I'm glad you brought up the whole host-guest dynamic. Because sometimes people of color feel like there's only a one-way traveling that happens. So it might be like, would you come and do something at my church, or let's have the once a year interdenominational worship service after Thanksgiving, or whatever that might look like. And what that ends up doing is, even though it can be productive and helpful, it's only one-way traveling. And so then sometimes that person of color might feel like they have the burden of responsibility to explain the problem of race to everyone on a Sunday evening or something. And so sometimes that tax can be taxing in the sense that the person feels like they have to be an educator rather than like be a member of the family who's welcome into the family to break bread together with one. So one of the things I liked about Gardner Taylor was I use this language of him as a crossover preacher, and that's what I call on us to do as well, to learn to become preachers who cross borders for the sake of the gospel, by which I mean with Taylor, people who are willing to engage in, negotiate various differences, whether they be racial, ethnic, ecclesial, linguistic, class differences even. But one of the things I liked about Gardner Taylor is that sometimes he played the guest, but other times he played the host. And so perhaps you might be used to playing the host in your context if you're trying to cross borders, but there could be spaces in which you're the guest. So I have a friend who's white who lives in Waukegan, Illinois. And a couple of years ago, I think this was before I made the move, he won the annual award for the local chapter of the NAACP. That blows your mind, right? That someone who's white would win a local award for the local chapter of the NAACP. But he was doing cross-cultural work in Black communities. But that didn't happen because he showed up 3 months earlier, right? That happened because he was willing to be a guest, willing to live in a space where he was one of the only people who looked like him, and willing to attend the local chapter meetings and willing to connect in the public schools. And so that was his ministry. And it took a few years for people to trust him, but eventually they did. And here he was, the recipient of an annual award. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. There are these opportunities that might be waiting right there for us. We shouldn't be surprised if we're the only person who looks like us in a space that people might not be sure about us at the beginning. And there might need to be some trust and credibility established at the outset. And it needs to be a gaining of respect and a gaining of trust over time.
Yeah, sometimes we're not patient enough to do that. We kind of want the instant. We want the instant credibility thing. Do you like preaching in English or Spanish better?
Oh, I'm second generation, born in the US, and English is my first language. So when I preach in Spanish, I feel like international students who preach in English in my classes. And so every time they do, I say, thank you. That's hard work, I know. So I do feel like that there are parts of me that I wish I could more ably communicate in my second language, and that there are parts of my personality that I wish could come out better because it's my second language. So I'm more tied to my notes and am more careful and use more precision. It also takes me about 3 times as long to prepare a sermon in Spanish than in English. But what I found to be the case is that people in those spaces are just remarkably generous and kind and hospitable toward me. And there's even a little poking of fun, like, oh, you're a US born Latino, but you've got it in your blood. So we're glad that you're here with us.
Well, I guess it's part of the nature of the world where towards the end of my teaching career, I would more and more often have students that had Latino names that might speak less Spanish than I did. And
right, absolutely. I have those students too, where because I'm half Anglo, and because there's certain images that people have in their mind of Latinos, there might be students who have darker skin, darker hair, that don't speak any Spanish, and they grew up in a home in which they didn't speak Spanish, or they're 6th generation Tejano, right? 6th generation Waco, and their parents actually didn't immigrate. Mexico became Texas, which became part of the United States, and so they've been here. There are families in San Antonio that have been here for 300 years. Yeah.
If let's see, I'm trying to think of the right way to come at this. Immigration is such a politicized thing in American life, and I think part of the encouragement here is it's too strong to say immigration is going to be the salvation of the North American church, but it could infuse some life there. There are many immigrants are coming and bringing a faith with them. I just, you live in Texas. How do you reflect on all of that?
Right. Well, I mentioned one of the professors at PTS, who's now retired. He's Professor Emeritus Luis Rivera Pagan from Puerto Rico. One of the things he liked to say, and this was tongue in cheek, so he's poking fun, but he liked to say that the border of Latin America used to be the Rio Grande, but now it's Canada, right? And why would he say that? Because of so much shifting, so much changing. Or I've heard someone say, what's the capital of Latin America? And their answer is Miami. And there's truth to it, because a lot of major cable stations have their headquarters in Miami. So there are these shifts taking place on account of globalization and immigration. And I do remain hopeful, not just because of Latin American immigration to the United States, documented and undocumented, but also just because of all of the ways that those who are self-identifying as Christians are asking themselves, what does it mean to be the church when I'm sojourning through a strange land, right? So that means there are Ethiopian congregations in Washington, D.C., and Nigerian congregations in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Brazilian congregations in Boston, Massachusetts, and Mexican congregations in Seattle and Portland. We might have ideas in our mind like California and Texas, but all over this nation, there are these immigrant congregations that are doubling over a decade or 2 decades, or tripling, or in the case of Nepali churches, from 5 to 150 in 7 years. So it's just remarkable to see. So I remain a lot more hopeful, I think, than most. But then the question we have to ask is, what does it mean on account of immigration, on account of globalization, on account of pluralism and all the shifts taking place, realities on the ground? What does it mean to preach in an intercultural church with an intercultural future? What does it mean to be the church if it's an intercultural church with an intercultural future?
Yeah, so just riff on that for a moment or two. What does it mean to be an intercultural church with an intercultural future?
Well, I mentioned one piece already. So it starts at the dinner table. It starts with the actions that we are willing to take outside of Sunday morning. I think part of the answer also, I'll quote from Bono, lead singer of U2. That might date me as in my 40s instead of the ages of my students. So my students might say, "Who's Bono?" But
you shame him. Yeah.
Yes, but he liked to say when he was interviewed, someone asked him about his journey of faith, and he said one of his mentors told him, "Bono, stop asking God to bless you. Find out what God is doing, because it's already blessed." And that was a shift. He wanted God to bless what he was doing, but instead he started to look to what God was doing, see that it was blessed, and asked himself. It's like the Richard Blackaby question, like, what's God doing? It's blessed what God is doing. So how do I partner in what God is doing? So that figure description of our context, I think, is important too, to ask what it means. It's not realistic for every church to become a multi-ethnic church, especially since our towns and counties and cities are different. So it might mean, what does it look like to partner with churches that are different denominations and different races, ethnicities, languages, cultures. So it might start with knowing the name of the pastor of that church. Simple things, right? Inviting that pastor to the monthly pastors gathering, if that's something that you do in your community. I think a big piece is critical cultural self-study. That's a big phrase, but Richard Weigel did this study on the Semester at Sea program that happens in a lot of colleges and universities. And they measured intercultural competence among students before the semester and measured those levels of cross-cultural competency. They called it intercultural competence at the end of the semester. And what they discovered, to their dismay, was that their levels of cross-cultural competency were the same. And so part of how they resolved that problem was they invited students to engage in critical cultural self-study. So there's actually assessments you can take. Perhaps you've heard of, like, David Livermore and cultural intelligence. So I think it's good to read some of his stuff on cross-cultural missions. He has a book on that. He has a book on just cultural intelligence more broadly. There's a book called Cultural Clusters. And there are assessments that we can take, which might reveal our blind spots. A lot of that work asks questions about what are our attitudes that we can change, what are our skills that we can develop, and what are our actions that we can take. And it can invite you into, like, the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, gives you an IDI plan in order to grow in your levels of intercultural competence. When it comes to preaching, I mentioned, interrogate your illustrations, think about issues not only of race and ethnicity, but class. There are ways that you can be an avid reader, not only of people who might look like you and come from the same background, but people who don't look like you and come from different backgrounds. So there's actually ways to grow into that cross-cultural knowledge. It's part of how we change our attitudes as we develop new knowledge of ourselves and of others. And that leads to further skills, which leads to beneficial action. So those are just some things. I hope I didn't overwhelm everybody.
Well, that's actually a little encouraging to think that, okay, it is something you can get better at. I think that there's some things you can do to sort of improve your reach and your competency. Because I think we do at the beginning feel a little overwhelmed that, I'm.
Yes. I think I'm a father of 3 kids, and so we watch a lot of Pixar movies. So if you've seen Ratatouille, there's a chef at the beginning of Ratatouille who likes to say, "Everyone can cook." And that's the hopeful word that I want to give to people. Everyone can grow into this, no matter how overwhelmed we feel. I mean, one characteristic of cross-cultural interaction and cross-cultural communication is that we crash into each other. There's going to be cultural misunderstandings. One time I told a student to put away his phone. We were in the middle of doing something and he just was on his phone the whole time. And this student came from an honor shame context. And but it was so distracting, I thought, to me and to the other students, that I needed to ask him, would you please put your phone away? Because it looked like all he was doing was texting. And he came up to me afterward, embarrassed, ashamed. And he said, Professor, I'm so sorry. I was trying to translate what you were saying. And so they were my assumptions, because every other student who would have been doing that wouldn't have been doing that.
Right. Right.
And those assumptions needed to be challenged. But how did they get challenged? They got challenged through misunderstanding and coming to a new understanding as a result. So sometimes we're the offender, sometimes we're the offended. But I think if we're willing to take those risks, push through that uncomfortability, I think we'll only be better for it. But yeah, it is overwhelming. But I hope it's a hopeful word to know that there are ways that we can grow and get better at it. And that's what things like the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, track. They say, okay, here's where you are. Usually there's a gap between where we think we are. It's self-serving bias, right? We think we're better at this than we actually are at it. And then we discover, okay, here's where I really am, what the data show. And then we can track over time. And there are other instruments like CQ, the Cultural Intelligence Questionnaire. We can track whether or not we're getting better in various areas over time as well.
It does strike me that we're going to have an unusually high degree of Christian generosity towards each other. And, it's one of the things that in the world has been sort of sadly lacking. We're going to have to give each other the benefit of the doubt in terms of our intentions, because, you're not going to get it right all the time.
Yes, but I do think that puts us in good company with the early church. So there's this anonymous epistle called the Epistle to Diognetus, and in that epistle there's this line about the Christians of that time period, and they weren't perfect; they were just like us. So I need to at least preface it that way. But when they were at their best, the line goes like this: to them, every land was a fatherland and a foreign land. So they knew that they were citizens of another country, but they also knew that even if they were in a land that was not their own, that it became to them, as it were, a fatherland, a motherland. Mm. So I think that's a great way to think about ministry, especially if the world around you is changing so rapidly, that you're in good company. You align yourself. You're in solidarity with the early church to say, yes, every land is to me both a foreign land and a fatherland. What does it mean to become a citizen of this country, of this place, even if it's changed in drastic ways, and it's very different than the community I came to, however many years I came to it.
It strikes me that's a really good last word, but I'll let you have one more word if there's something you really want to say on the way out. You have a final encouraging word beyond that.
Well, I'll leave it there. If it encouraged you, then I'm encouraged. I hope it encouraged all those who participated in this webinar. I'm thankful to be able to do this work. There's this saying, I don't know if it's Helmut Thielicke, I'd have to track down the source, but in some ways our theologies are our autobiographies in disguise. So here I am, a half Latino, half white, son of an immigrant who grew up in subsidized housing in which there were 40 different nationalities represented. And what I like to say is I'm a Latino ordained Baptist minister who studied a famous African-American Christian preacher at a mainline Presbyterian seminary. So just that for a minute.
Yeah. What going on? Yeah.
In a way, crossover preaching is what has been part of my life, and what I want to commend or propose to others could be more a part of their lives too, especially as they think about how to learn to speak better Babylonian, right? How to learn to speak to the people who are in front of you and who will be in front of you in the years to come.
Well, thank you very much for your time and your expertise and the encouragement. Really appreciate that. We always close with a word of blessing, and thank you for everybody who's been here. This is the last intersection this year. We'll pick up again in January. We have some great people lined up, and we'll look forward to more conversations in the coming year. A word of blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.